and we need someone to help us because we have no idea what we're looking at. How much is this worth? What does this software do? And can you tell us, what is the retail price of the software? Because that's how these criminal cases will eventually be sentenced. We say, okay, how many points on the criminal chart do they get? Is going to equal how much time they're going to do in prison for the most part, although the judge will talk about that more in a moment. We need to know what's the retail price of the infringed good, because the loss calculation is what's going to really increase the amount of time they face in jail. Only we don't know what the product's worth. So we had to bring in Rockwell and say, here are all the eBay records. Tell us what these people sold and how much it's worth. But here's another example. What you're looking at here is tens of thousands of pills of counterfeit Viagra. This was a case where the defendant was obviously trafficking in counterfeit goods. This Viagra, although it looks identical to regular Viagra, actually had very little active ingredient in it. It did have a tremendous amount of impurities in it. It had a couple of chemicals and drugs in it that if you actually used it with alcohol, you would become nauseous, you could possibly seizure, you would be throwing up constantly. It was just something that Pfizer would not put into Viagra normally. And the counterfeiter doesn't care what's in it. As long as it looks good and he can pass it off to the consumer, that's what's going to happen. In this case, what happens when we partner up with industry is, I need to get this stuff tested. I need to know right away, do we have counterfeit? Do we have authentic? Do we have gray market? What is it? The FDA might be backed up. The Food and Drug Administration might be backed up. You have pet food, you have toothpaste. I need to get this stuff tested too. Well, who's on the front line? The attorneys, Pfizer, the labs, they test it. Within 48 hours, I know whether or not this product is counterfeit or not counterfeit. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate those results later on through the federal government, because you want an independent source in order to go forward with the criminal prosecution. So you see how the private sector becomes very important in doing these cases. Search warrants, equally so. The last search warrant I executed was in Detroit. It was a 100,000 square foot facility. There is no way Agent Tarver or any of his buddies could go in there and seize 100,000 square feet of counterfeit goods. And I don't even know what's counterfeit in there. So the thing I did is I put in the warrant for a judge just like Judge Liu, saying I need the private sector to be there. The attorneys, the investigators, whoever, the trademark holders, I need them to go into this search site after everything is secure, no one's going to get hurt, and identify the goods, because we need to know what we're seizing. And that's something you'll see more and more prosecutors putting into their search warrants, and you should expect that to come your way. But what keeps us up at night is basically a whole bunch of things keep us up at night. The Fourth Amendment, ethical constraints, electronic surveillance, grand jury issues, legal defenses, you name it. I just want to quickly go through this. But Fourth Amendment issues, when we start working with, a case gets referred criminally to us, for criminal prosecution from the private sector. And we work with private sector attorneys, the investigators, the trademark holders. What happens? Well, if we start directing the private sector to do certain things, what happens is the private sector becomes a government agent. And so we have to worry about agency. Agency is fine. There's nothing wrong with agency. But if the private sector becomes the government agent, you're going to get held to exactly the same standards that Agent Tarver is going to get held to. And anything that's done illegally or unethically is going to be imputed from you onto the U.S. attorney who's doing the prosecution. So oftentimes when I meet with private investigators who are working with the attorneys, I'll sit them down and say, look, we're happy to work this case with you, but understand one thing. You're going to be treated just like an agent, and you're going to follow exactly the laws and procedures and ethical codes that agents will have to follow. Now, when you have this agency relationship, this is a pitfall, and one attorney and one private investigator I didn't work with, but I had met, had fallen into this trap. And what happened was that they referred a case criminally at the same time they were going forward with their civil proceedings. And you'll find some AUSAs, assistant U.S. attorneys in the field, if they take a case criminally, they're going to ask you to stop your civil case. Be prepared for that, because it can mess up a long-term investigation that the government may have going on in the criminal case. But what happened in this particular case is that the attorney was sort of supervising the private investigator, but not much, letting him be on his own. The private investigator, after the case was referred criminally and after he was already a government agent under the direction, went back to the company and started talking to people who were already represented by counsel. Well, this was a huge mess, because you cannot get around the rules by using the private sector to talk to people who are already represented by counsel. And I just point this out as an example because there are other pitfalls that some attorneys and some private investigators fall into. For example,